Hell had always been a place of noise. The endless grinding of bone against stone, the wet hiss of rivers that ran with something older than blood, the low chanting of priests who no longer remembered what tongue they were speaking. For eons, this cacophony had been the heartbeat of the infernal realms, a rhythm so constant that even the damned had learned to sleep through it. But on this particular hour, in a corner of hell that had known nothing but silence for 1,000 years, that heartbeat stuttered. The Doomslayer had been walking across a plateau of blackened glass when he first felt it. Not through his ears, for the sound had not yet arrived, but through the marrow of his bones, through the plates of his ancient armor, through the seething core of argent energy that pulsed beneath his skin. Something had shifted in the architecture of this place. Something had entered a room that had been sealed since the first star was lit. He paused, only for a breath, and then continued forward. He had learned long ago that curiosity in hell was a currency best spent slowly. Far to the north, past the ossuary plains and beyond the sulfur seas, the sky itself began to bruise. A stain spread across the crimson vault, deeper than red, deeper than black, a color that did not belong to any spectrum the demons had names for. The stain widened, split, and then peeled open like a wound that had grown tired of healing. From the tear came a sound that reached every kingdom of hell at once, a single low note that made the mountains lean away from it. In the cathedral cities, the archdemons rose from their thrones. In the burning marshes, the hound packs stopped their hunting and stood very still. In the deepest pits, where the oldest things slept beneath layers of forgotten prayer, eyes that had not opened in ages cracked wide and searched the ceiling of the world. Every ancient thing in hell recognized the vibration for what it was. Something had arrived that did not belong to this reality, and it had arrived without permission. The abandoned battlefield beneath the rift had once been the site of a war so terrible that even hell had chosen to forget it. Rusted banners still leaned against skeletons the size of hills. Cracked weapons jutted from the ground like broken teeth. It was here that the wound in the sky finally gave birth. A shape fell from it, tumbling end over end, striking the earth with a force that turned stone to powder for miles in every direction. When the dust settled, he was standing. He did not remember his name. He did not remember the yellow sun of a world called Earth, or the woman in red and blue who had once bought his death with her own, or the scientist whose obsession with perfection had bound suffering to bone and called it a sun. He remembered only a single sensation, rage. Not the hot rage of insult, nor the cold rage of grief, but a deeper thing. The rage of a creature born inside a cage and carved by the hands that held the key. His fists opened and closed. His lungs pulled at air that tasted of copper and ash, and something in him decided that this air, and everything that breathed it, deserved to die. The first legion to reach him was a horde of the lesser damned, sent forward by an overseer who mistook the tremor for a fresh soul harvest. They came howling across the plain in a tide of teeth and hooves, 10,000 strong, banners of flayed skin flapping behind them. Their overseer, a bloated thing on a throne of writhing serpents, watched from a distant ridge and prepared to claim the newcomer as tribute for his master. He never gave the order to attack. The order was unnecessary. Doomsday walked forward, and the plain simply ended around him. The first rank of demons struck his chest and burst apart like clay dropped from a great height. The second rank tried to swarm his legs and were ground into the earth before they could scream. The third rank turned to flee, and he was already among them, moving with a speed that had no business existing inside a body so large. His arms rose and fell like the pistons of a machine that had been built by no one and belonged to nothing. Whole rows of the horde vanished between one heartbeat and the next. The overseer watched his throne empty. He watched his commanders liquefy. He watched a river of blood begin to run backward along its ancient channel, refusing to flow toward a creature that offended even the laws of hell. He tried to speak a word of banishment, an old word, a word that had once turned back a prince of the outer dark. Doomsday reached the ridge before the word was finished. The overseer's crown fell into the dust, and there was no head left inside it. Across the wider realms, the archdemons hesitated. It had been an age since any of them had hesitated at anything. In their war rooms of carved obsidian, they leaned over maps of bone and traced the trail of destruction with fingers that had, until now, always known where every horror in hell was born. This one was not on their maps. This one had not been summoned. This one was answering to no chain they had forged. And in a kingdom 3 realms distant, standing over the smoking corpse of a hell baron he had just torn in half, the Doomslayer lifted his head. He listened to a silence he had not heard in centuries. Not the silence of victory, for that silence always had demons in it, whispering, fleeing, regrouping. This was a different silence. This was the silence of a room that has just discovered a spider larger than itself. Hell was afraid, not of him, of something else. Slowly, the Slayer turned toward the north. Somewhere in that direction, another crusade had begun, and it was not his. He tightened his grip on the super shotgun and started walking, and the ground beneath him began to hum with the promise of a hunt he had never expected to be given. The dark priests convened in a chamber that had no floor. They floated above a well that dropped through every level of hell and opened into a darkness older than the pit itself. And they spoke in a language that predated the invention of mouths. For hours their debate rippled through the void, and for hours no conclusion could be reached, because none of them wished to be the first to say the word they were all thinking. The word was uncontrollable. At last the eldest among them, a robed thing with too many joints in each finger, admitted what could no longer be hidden. This creature that had fallen from the wound in the sky could not be killed by ordinary means. Every legion sent against him had returned as red mist on the wind. Every weapon that had struck him had lost its edge on the second blow, and its purpose on the third. He was not merely strong, he was learning. And in hell, a thing that learned was a thing that could rule. Since he could not be destroyed, the priests decided he would be bound. Rituals were prepared that had not been performed since the imprisonment of the first betrayer. Circles of blood were painted in patterns whose lines existed in dimensions beyond 3. Chains were dragged up from vaults where they had lain forgotten. Chains that had once held titans still while their eyes were removed. Chains whose links had been forged from the vertebrae of gods. The greatest of these was a collar that had once hung around the throat of a beast so terrible that its name had been struck from every record. And yet it had knelt when the collar closed. Surely, the priests reasoned, this new thing would kneel as well. They dragged their traps across 3 kingdoms to meet him. They lured him into a valley where the walls had been carved with sigils that drank strength from anything that stood between them. They summoned 12 titans of the old blood, creatures so vast that clouds gathered at their shoulders, and they set them loose upon him in a single coordinated wave. Doomsday met them in the valley floor. The first titan brought its fist down on him, and the impact sank him to his waist in the stone. He rose out of the crater with the titan's arm already broken across his shoulder. The second titan tried to seize him and lost its jaw. The third opened its chest and released a beam of primordial fire that would have unmade a mountain. And Doomsday walked through it. His skin blistered, then blackened, then hardened into a new plate that had not existed a moment before. When the beam ended, he was still walking, and the plate was still there. By the 4th titan, he had begun to change. Bone spurs erupted from his forearms in patterns that had not been present at his arrival. His eyes, which had glowed red, now burned a deeper hue that hurt to look at. When the 6th titan finally broke his spine across its knee, he lay in the dust for the length of a heartbeat, and then he rose, and the spine was thicker, and the titan was afraid. The priests watched from their high seats and understood at last what had come into their house. This was not a slave in the making. This was the shape of a hunger that no chain could satisfy, because every chain would only teach it how to break a stronger chain. One of the priests began, quietly, to laugh, and the others turned to look at him. And then they too began to laugh, because there was nothing else left to do. The circles collapsed, the chains snapped. The collar was crushed underfoot as if it had been made of paper, and Doomsday, now taller by a hand's breadth than he had been at dawn, walked out of the valley and into the ruined city beyond, and left the ruins even more ruined than he had found them. Across the ashes of a nearby kingdom, the Doomslayer knelt beside a corpse. He had been following the trail for 2 days. The trail was not difficult to find. It was less a path than an incision, a straight line of annihilation drawn across the map of hell as if by a hand that had never once considered turning aside. Wherever he stopped, he found the same thing. Demons torn open by no weapon he recognized. Wounds that suggested no blade, no bullet, no beam. The flesh was pulped, the bone was pulverized. The marks upon the ground were the marks of fists and feet, and nothing else. He crouched beside the ribcage of a baron and set 2 fingers against the shattered edge. Inside his helmet, a soft voice began to speak. Vega reported what he already suspected. The rate of tissue destruction indicated a force multiplier that exceeded any known infernal or argent source. More troublingly, Vega noted that the pattern of injuries across several battlefields showed adaptation. Early victims had been killed by simple impacts. Later victims bore evidence of counter-tactics, of angles chosen specifically to bypass demonic defenses that the attacker could not have known about before the first encounter. Whatever this thing was, it was studying its opponents even as it destroyed them. It was becoming what it needed to be in real time, and it had needed to be many things already. The Slayer stood. Behind the black glass of his visor, no expression could be read, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, and Vega, who had known him longer than any living thing, recognized it. It was the shift that came when the hunt stopped being routine. For centuries, the Slayer had walked through hell as the only unbroken thing in it. He had grown accustomed to being the answer to every question the demons asked. Now, somewhere ahead of him, another answer was walking, and the demons were asking it a different question, and receiving the same reply he himself would have given. He did not know yet whether the thing he was hunting was an enemy, an ally, or something for which no word yet existed. He knew only that he intended to look at it with his own eyes. He rose, checked the load in his super shotgun, and continued north into the ruin. The fortress had been called Karen V. Hull in an age before spoken languages, and its walls had once been considered unbreachable by any force in the 4 hells. Now it lay in halves. The eastern gate had been driven inward by a single strike, its adamant hinges twisted like ribbon. The great central spire had been snapped off at the middle and lay across the courtyard like a felled tree. Bodies filled every corridor, every stair, every archway, in numbers so great that the stone beneath them could no longer be seen. And at the heart of the ruin, upon a mound of the dead that rose 3 stories high, Doomsday stood, unmoving, waiting. He did not know he was waiting. He would not have used that word. But something inside him, some remnant of the design that had built him, had recognized that another force was approaching, and had chosen to stand still and see what it was. The Doomslayer crested the outer wall without speaking. He looked down into the courtyard, and for a long moment, neither figure moved. 2 silhouettes stood etched against the smoldering red of a hellish afternoon, and the world around them held its breath. Even the flames on the broken banners seemed to slow. Then the Slayer descended. He walked across the field of corpses without slipping once, his boots finding the small, solid places between the ruin. He stopped at the base of the mound and looked up. Doomsday looked down. Neither carried a banner, neither wore a name, neither made a gesture of greeting or of warning. Yet, in the silence between them, an entire conversation passed. Each recognized in the other something that had never been recognized before. Each understood that the fight to come would not be a matter of victory. It would be a matter of learning how large the world was. The Slayer drew the super shotgun. The first shell struck Doomsday in the center of the chest. The impact rolled him back 3 paces along the top of the mound and cracked a plate of his hide. The second shell tore through the shoulder and buried itself in muscle. The third missed the head by inches as Doomsday leapt from the mound in a single bound that carried him across the entire courtyard. They met in the middle of the ruined hall. The Slayer sidestepped the first strike and drove the barrel of the super shotgun into Doomsday's ribs, firing at contact. The blast opened a hole the size of a helmet in the creature's side. Doomsday responded with a backhand that caught the Slayer in the chest plate and sent him through 3 interior walls. Stone dust filled the corridor. The Slayer rose from the rubble already reloading. He switched weapons. The ballista sang. A bolt of pure argent light lanced across the hall and struck Doomsday between the eyes. The head snapped back. Smoke rose from the wound. For an instant, the Slayer allowed himself the thought that this would be swift. Then Doomsday's head came forward again, and the wound had already closed, and beneath the closed wound a new plate of bone had grown, thicker than the last. The Slayer switched again. Rockets tore across the ruined hall in pairs, each explosion strong enough to fall a cyber demon. Doomsday walked through the fire and caught the fourth rocket in his fist before it could reach him, crushing it against his palm. The blast tore his hand apart. The hand grew back before it finished falling. The crucible ignited. The Slayer moved with speed that even Sentinel eyes could not follow, closing the gap in a single blur and driving the blade of argent light through Doomsday's throat. The blade passed clean through. The creature stumbled. For the length of a breath, he was almost dead. And then his neck thickened, and the wound sealed, and his hand closed around the Slayer's helmet and hurled him through the collapsed spire of the fortress. The BFG came last. The Slayer stood in the shattered courtyard and lifted the great green weapon and fired. The world went white. When color returned, Doomsday was on one knee. His chest had been opened. His left arm was gone at the shoulder. His skin was smoking in 100 places. He looked, for the first time since his arrival, like a thing that could die. Then his arm grew back. It did not grow back as it had been. It grew back armored, ridged with new spurs of black bone, thicker and longer than the original. He rose. His eyes had changed color again. He looked at the Slayer across the ruin, and though he had no words, everything about him spoke a single sentence. Try that again. The Slayer lowered the BFG. Behind his visor, Vega was already speaking, and the numbers Vega was reciting had ceased to make sense. Adaptation rate exceeding modeled parameters. Recovery efficiency approaching 1-to-1. Energy signature no longer matching known thresholds. In simpler words, the thing before him was becoming stronger faster than the Slayer could damage it. Every wound was a lesson. Every death was a rehearsal. Yet the Slayer did not retreat. He set the BFG upon his back and drew the super shotgun again, and he walked forward across the ruined courtyard, and Doomsday met him halfway. They fought without weapons then, because weapons had stopped being the point. The Slayer struck with fists that had toppled archdemons, and Doomsday struck with fists that had, in another life, killed a god. The ruined fortress could not hold their battle. Walls fell. Foundations cracked. The floor of hell itself began to complain. Hours became days. Elsewhere, entire kingdoms watched the horizon glow with the fire of a fight that would not end. Rivers boiled and reversed course. Mountains cracked along ancient seams. Demons that had never fled from anything gathered their kin and moved south, away from the light. In the deep places, where the oldest things listened, a slow and terrible attention began to gather itself. Neither combatant fell. The Slayer took wounds that would have killed a lesser sentinel 100 times over. And each time he rose, because rising was the only verb his life had ever known. Doomsday took wounds that would have unmade a titan, and each time he rose, because rising was written into the marrow of him. At last, on the third day, they stood apart across a crater that had once been a city, breathing hard, looking at each other, and understanding that this could not continue. Beneath their feet, something else had begun to stir. The Slayer felt it first as a pressure behind his eyes. Then as a tone that seemed to be sung by the stone itself, a sound so low it was more suggestion than noise. He straightened slowly, and Doomsday, across the crater, straightened too, tilting his head to one side like a beast that had heard its name spoken in another room. Inside the Slayer's helmet, Vega became very quiet, and then began to speak with the specific calmness he reserved for things he did not fully understand. He had, VEGA explained, been running a passive query against the deep Sentinel archives from the moment the trail of adaptation had first been identified. The query had returned nothing for a long time. The archives were old, and their oldest layers had been sealed by the wraiths and ages before the Sentinel Order had a name. But the tone now rising from the stone had triggered a match, and the match had opened a record that even the wraiths had preferred to forget. The record was called, in a language that had died before humanity was born, the warning of the king beneath the root. Long before the Dark Lord ever climbed the throne of hell, before the first demon ever bit the first soul, there had been another power in this place. It had not been born, and it had not been made. It had simply existed, the way hunger exists between meals, a shape without a body waiting for something to fill it. The oldest Sentinel kings had fought it, and had lost again, and had at last understood that it could not be defeated by strength, because strength was the food it ate. So they had bound it instead, at the bottom of hell, in a prison of paradox and stone, and they had sealed the prison with the one thing it could not consume, which was silence. The Sentinels had called it the First Devourer, Its nature was simple in the way that a nightmare is simple. It fed upon conflict between immortal beings. Ordinary battle did not interest it. Ordinary death was too small to nourish it. But when two things that could not die struck at each other, again and again, when neither could yield and neither could break, the resonance of that meeting slipped through cracks in reality and reached the prison, and the prison drank it in, and the thing inside the prison grew. Vega finished the record. He was silent for a moment afterward. Then he added, in a voice that was almost gentle, that the resonance readings currently emanating from the Slayer's own position were higher than any recorded in Sentinel history. The prison seals were not merely weakening, they were splitting. The Slayer looked across the crater at Doomsday. Doomsday looked back. Neither moved. For the first time in the memory of any being still alive, the Slayer took a step backward. Vega continued more quickly now. The historical record indicated that the Devourer had never been permitted to feed upon a duel of this scale. In the ancient wars, whenever two immortals had begun to collide with the necessary intensity, one of them had always been removed from the conflict, hidden, wounded, or destroyed by a third party, precisely to starve the prisoner beneath the root. The Sentinels had understood this rule. The Wraiths had enforced it. And now, in this era, that enforcement had failed, because a creature had fallen from a wound in the sky that no Sentinel had known to prepare for. The Slayer understood then why Hell had run. He understood why the archdemons had hesitated over their maps. He understood why the Dark Priests had chosen to try to bind Doomsday instead of destroy him. He understood, with a coldness that reached farther inside him than any injury of the last 3 days, that Hell had not been afraid of Doomsday. Hell had been afraid of what Doomsday, meeting the Slayer, would wake up. And then, worse still, Vega offered one final calculation. The trail that had led the Slayer here had not been random. The path of destruction that had drawn him across the kingdoms had been arranged. Certain demons had failed to intercept Doomsday, who ought easily to have died stopping him. Certain gates had been left open. Certain messengers had escaped with news that had reached the Slayer's ears at precisely the moment his own hunt had lulled. The Slayer had not tracked Doomsday. He had been led to Doomsday, and Doomsday, in his own way, had been led to him. Hell had wanted this meeting. Hell had needed it. Hell had orchestrated it. And Hell, in doing so, had made a bargain the demons themselves might not survive. Because the king beneath the root, once free, would not distinguish between demons and sentinels when it began to eat. The Slayer lowered his hand from the grip of his shotgun. Across the crater, Doomsday shifted his weight. He did not understand Vega words. He did not know what was buried beneath their feet, but some ancient predatory instinct, older than his own creation, had turned his attention downward, and his fists were beginning to open and close in a rhythm that suggested he could feel a presence rising to meet him. The ground shook. Not the shake of an earthquake, which is chaotic and brief, but the slow, deliberate shudder of a chest beginning to draw breath after a very long sleep. Somewhere, deep, deep below, a chain the size of a mountain range slipped its final anchor. Dust rose in a column across the crater and did not settle. The Slayer weighed his choices in the quiet corner of his mind that had never once panicked in 10,000 years. He could continue the fight and win and doom existence. He could withdraw and be hunted forever by the thing across the crater and eventually resume the fight anyway. Or he could do the one thing he had never done in the whole of his crusade. He could accept that his enemy, for the length of this one crisis, would have to become something other than an enemy. He did not move toward Doomsday, but he did not raise his weapon. Above them both, the sky of Hell began to crack in a new place, and something was looking up. The first sign of the Devourer was not the Devourer itself. It was the absence of Hell around it. Where its influence spread, color leached from the stone. Fires that had burned since the founding of the pit dimmed to a sullen gray. Sounds thinned, as though heard through water, and then thickened, as though heard through mud. The demons closest to the crater began to change without noticing. Their eyes glassed over. Their movements stuttered. They turned upon their own commanders with expressions of mild interest, as if opening a curious book, and tore them apart in the same distracted way. Then they turned upon each other. Across 3 kingdoms, this corruption spread. Legions that had marched in disciplined ranks a moment earlier dissolved into knots of feeding. Cities that had stood for millennia began to sag inward, as if the ground beneath them had lost interest in holding them up. In the vast throne room of a baron who had ruled a quarter of hell since before the birth of the sun, the baron himself rose from his seat, walked to the balcony, looked down at his burning kingdom and stepped off, not because he wished to fall, but because gravity had suggested it, and he had found no reason to disagree. Reality bent. Time bent with it. In some corridors of hell, the same hour repeated itself again and again, the same demons dying in the same postures, unaware that they had died already. In other places, minutes stretched into years, and the damned aged inside them and turned to dust, and the dust wept quietly to itself because it remembered being young. Gravity failed in patches. Whole flocks of the lesser damned rose slowly into the sky, screaming without breath, and hung there like insects trapped in amber. At the edges of the crater where the Slayer and Doomsday still stood, the ground began to grow eyes. They opened wet and blinking, in the surfaces of stones, in the bark of blackened trees, in the pooled blood of the recent dead. They did not look at the Slayer, and they did not look at Doomsday. They looked past both of them, up at the sky, and their expressions were the expressions of a congregation waiting for a hymn. Something enormous moved beneath the crater. It did not rise in one motion. It rose in the way that a continent rises out of the sea over generations, one hill at a time. First a ridge broke the floor of the crater and revealed itself to be a knuckle. Then another ridge appeared, a mile distant, and revealed itself to be another knuckle of the same hand. The Slayer looked at the two ridges and understood the scale of what was climbing toward the surface. Between the ridges, a plain of black skin was rising, and upon the plain, tendrils were unfolding themselves out of pores the size of gates. The tendrils came first. They lashed across the crater in patterns too complex to dodge, striking at every source of heat and motion. The Slayer moved without thinking, ducking under one, cutting another with the crucible, taking a third across the shoulder plate hard enough to send him tumbling across the black stone. He rose already firing. The ballista bolts sank into the tendrils and did not emerge on the far side. The wounds closed. New tendrils grew from the wounds. Doomsday met the tendrils with his fists. He did not dodge, because dodging was not written into him. He struck the nearest tendril at the base and felt the tendril strike back, and the tendril was thicker than his chest, and it drove him backward across the crater at a speed that ought to have killed him. He hit a wall of stone, and the stone shattered around him, and he rose from the rubble already growing new plates along his forearms, and he charged the tendril again. For a while the two of them fought their separate battles. The Slayer with his weapons, Doomsday with his body, each pretending, in the way that proud things pretend, that they had not seen the other. Tendrils fell to the crucible. Tendrils fell to Doomsday's fists. And for every tendril that fell, two new tendrils rose, because the thing beneath the crater was learning, faster than the Slayer, faster even than Doomsday. It was learning from both of them at once, and it was using what it learned against them both. The Slayer took a strike that cracked the plate over his heart. He staggered, and a tendril curled toward his neck. Doomsday broke it in half. Neither of them looked at the other afterward. Neither of them acknowledged what had happened, but the next tendril that reached for Doomsday's back was cut in two by a bolt of argent light, and Doomsday did not turn to see who had fired it, because he already knew. They began, without speaking, to move together. They did not coordinate. They could not have. The Slayer's discipline and Doomsday's instinct had nothing in common, but their absence of common ground turned out, in this hour, to be a kind of harmony. The Slayer chose targets that required precision. Doomsday chose targets that required force. Where the Slayer needed cover, Doomsday's back appeared to provide it. Where Doomsday needed a moment to regenerate, the Slayer's fire filled the gap. Neither of them slowed. Neither of them consulted. They fought as two hands of a body that had never met itself before, and the body was terrifyingly effective. The tendrils began to fall faster than they could grow. Above them, the great ridges of knuckles began to sink again, very slowly, as if the hand had decided to reconsider its emergence. The eyes in the stones blinked less often. A wind that had been rising began to fall. Hell, watching from every direction it still had eyes to watch with, saw the impossible happen. The two great destroyers of its age were fighting side by side, and Hell was losing. In the deep prison, the Devourer felt something it had not felt in 100 million years. It felt inconvenience. The Slayer did not permit himself relief. He knew that the tendrils were not the devourer. They were only the first breath of it, the reach of a hand not yet fully lifted. Whatever was coming next would not be broken by two fighters and their improvised understanding. It would require more and worse, and something neither of them had yet been asked to give. Beside him, Doomsday snarled at the settling sky, and the snarl was less rage than warning. The truce, unspoken, held. Not all who watched the impossible were content to let it continue. Deep beneath the crater, in a throne room of black glass suspended above a fall of endless fire, the Dark Lord of this age of hell stirred at last. He had been a spectator until now, as was his preference. He had watched Doomsday tear through his priests. He had watched the Slayer descend upon his fortresses. He had watched the Devourer begin to wake and had not been displeased, for the Devourer had been an old ally of his line, and its return had been part of the wager. But now the wager was failing. The two warriors were fighting together, and the food he had promised his ancient partner was being denied. He rose from his throne and put on his armor, and the armor put itself on him faster than his hands could work, because it had been made hungry by the years it had waited. He walked out of his throne room and up through the levels of hell, and every kingdom he passed emptied of its rulers, because his passing was a summons no lord dared refuse. By the time he reached the crater at the roof of the world, an army walked behind him, and it was the last army hell had. He came alone across the ruined ground. The Slayer and Doomsday stopped fighting the last of the tendrils and turned to face him. The Slayer had expected him for hours. Doomsday had not expected him at all, but recognized authority when it approached, and his fists opened and closed in anticipation. The Dark Lord spoke, and his voice was not loud, and did not need to be. He spoke first, to Doomsday. He offered a bargain, in the language of promises that need no translation. He said that this world was small, and this fight was small, and that a creature born to destroy deserved a larger stage. He said that if Doomsday would kill the Slayer for him here, now, he would open every door in every hell across every age. Wars without end, enemies without number, battles that would never repeat, for as long as memory would hold. Every kill would grow him. Every dawn would find him stronger. He would become the last living thing in the universe, and the universe would learn to say his name. He extended his hand. Doomsday looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he tore the hand off at the wrist and threw it into the fires. The Dark Lord looked down at the stump where his hand had been. He looked up at Doomsday. He said quietly that this had been foolish. And then he raised what remained of his arm, and the last army of hell came over the ridge. There were titans in that army who had not walked since the fall of the old kings. There were creatures whose names had been erased from the archives, because the archives had feared to hold them. There were barons and archdemons and things without categories, and behind them all, walking on legs that folded the wrong way, came a thing with too many faces, each face wearing the expression of a different hell. The battle that followed had no shape. It could not be described as a line or a field or a siege. It happened across every direction at once. Continents of stone rose and fell as combatants used them for weapons. Rivers of fire were diverted, dammed, and released like arrows. The sky above the crater cracked into a dozen fragments, and each fragment showed a different color of light, and the lights fought each other as if they too had chosen sides. The Slayer moved through the chaos as he had always moved, cutting the command structures out of the enemy the way a surgeon cuts tumors out of a patient. He killed the field marshals first. He killed the ritualists second. He killed the standard bearers third. Wherever the enemy tried to form a coordinated response, he arrived before the response was finished, and the response was not finished. Doomsday did not bother with structure. He hit the largest thing he could see. When it fell, he hit the next largest thing. He moved through the army the way weather moves through a forest, without malice, without plan, and without any interest in what he was breaking. Above the battle, unnoticed by the demons, the ground was growing eyes again. The tendrils were rising again. The Devourer, unseen but not unfelt, was feeding faster than at any point in its long imprisonment. Every strike of Titan against Slayer, of Doomsday against Baron, of demon against demon, all of it fell into the depths and did not come back. Vega saw it before either warrior did. He spoke inside the Slayer's helmet with a new urgency. The Devourer's resonance readings were now climbing exponentially. The prison seals below the crater had cracked completely on the outer layers. The inner layers were holding by the width of a hair, and the devourer, VEGA reported, was no longer feeding only on the duel above it. It was feeding on the war around it. Every strike, every death, every roar of rage was pouring into its mouth, and its mouth was widening to receive more. Worse, Vega continued, the pattern of consumption had shifted. In the earlier hours, the devourer had grown selectively, adding mass and reach. Now it was growing in dimensions that did not correspond to any measurable axis. It was, Vega said, in effect, becoming. The Slayer understood, and in understanding he saw at last the trap in its full shape. The Dark Lord had not needed to win the battle at the crater. He had needed only to prolong it. Every second that the Slayer and Doomsday spent fighting his army was a second of food for the thing beneath, and the thing beneath was almost ready to rise. Whether the Slayer killed the Dark Lord or the Dark Lord killed the Slayer, whether Doomsday tore through every Titan or every Titan tore through Doomsday, the outcome above no longer mattered. The outcome below did. The Slayer turned from the immediate fight. He looked across the burning field, and he found Doomsday, and he caught his eye. And though the two of them had never spoken a syllable to each other, an understanding passed between them in the pause of a single heartbeat. They had to stop fighting hell. They had to fall into it. Vega composed the plan in the pause of that single heartbeat and delivered it in a voice barely louder than a breath. The Devourer, VEGA explained, was a thing built entirely of consumption. It could not be reasoned with, and it could not be starved in time, because the war above had already fed it too long. There remained only one path. It had to be destroyed from within, and it had to be destroyed faster than it could adapt. Every second of hesitation would allow it to evolve past whatever measure was used against it. Every measured strike would teach it how to defend against the next. Only overwhelming force, delivered in the deepest place of its being, could catch it in a form still small enough to break. The Slayer, Vega continued, would be the spear. Doomsday, VEGA concluded, would be the shield. The Slayer would descend to the core of the prison and destroy the ancient anchors that had once held the Devourer and now held its shape together. Once the anchors were gone, the creature would collapse inward. But to reach the anchors, the Slayer would need to pass through layers of consumption that could not be survived by any single fighter alone. He needed a companion who could take wounds faster than the Devourer could deliver them, who could evolve as quickly as the enemy did, and who could burn through his own suffering without breaking. He needed Doomsday, and Doomsday, without being asked, understood. They abandoned the battle at the surface. The Dark Lord shouted after them in a fury that shook the roof of hell, but they did not hear him, because they were already falling. The crater floor split beneath their weight, and they dropped through it, deliberately, together, into the darkness that had been waiting for them all along. The descent was longer than either of them expected. They fell past the boneyards of forgotten wars, and the tendrils reached up to slow them, and Doomsday broke the tendrils as they came. They fell past cathedrals of frozen screaming, and the eyes in the walls tracked their passage, and the Slayer's shotgun answered every eye. They fell past strata of hell that had no names, past chambers where the damned had been repurposed as furniture, past halls where reality had been folded into shapes that hurt to think about. And still they fell, because the prison of the Devourer had been dug deeper than the roots of the world. At last they struck the floor, and the floor was not floor, it was flesh. The Devourer's body, seen from inside, had no coherent shape. It was a landscape and a creature at the same time, an interior geography of pulsing organs the size of cities, of rivers of digestive fire, of nerves that hung across the sky like constellations. There was gravity here, but it did not always point down. There was air here, but it did not always fill lungs. Reality obeyed the Devourer's convenience, and the Devourer's convenience was to consume. The moment they arrived, it noticed them. The landscape rose against them. Mountains that were organs contracted and hurled slabs of themselves at the intruders. Rivers of fire rerouted uphill to cut them off. The constellations of nerves discharged in coordinated arcs, each arc precise enough to strike a target the size of a helmet at any distance. Doomsday met the first arc with his chest. The strike drove him to his knees. His skin split, his bones cracked, and then his skin sealed and his bones thickened, and when he rose his chest was armored in a plate that had not existed a moment before. The next arc struck the plate and rebounded. The third arc curved around the plate, and Doomsday, learning as fast as the arc did, raised his forearm and caught it, and his forearm too grew a plate, and the plate too rebounded, and by the fifth arc Doomsday had learned enough to redirect the discharge back into the nerve that had fired it. The nerve burst. The Slayer moved beneath his shield. Every moment that Doomsday drew fire, the Slayer advanced. He ran along ridges of muscle that flexed to throw him. He leapt across chasms whose walls tried to close on him. He fired the crucible into hearts that were not hearts, into the great pulsing anchors that held the Devourer's form in its prison shape. Each anchor destroyed sent a shudder through the landscape. Each shudder brought the landscape closer to collapse. The Devourer began to speak. It did not speak with a mouth because it had no mouth. It spoke by rearranging the geography around them into shapes that were words. Mountains rose in the pattern of a sentence. Rivers curled into punctuation. And what it said to the Slayer and to Doomsday in turn was that they had been made for each other, that they were the reason it had waited, that every immortal duel in every dimension had merely been a rehearsal, and now, at last, the true performers had arrived. If they would only continue their fight, it whispered, it would raise them above all creation, and they would rule with it as brothers of the void. The Slayer did not answer, because answering was not what the Slayer did. Doomsday did not answer either, because Doomsday could not. But something happened in the flesh of the landscape that had never happened in the Devourer's long memory. Doomsday, in the middle of a strike, turned aside and stood between the Slayer and an anchor that was firing. He did not do so because he had been asked. He did so because, somewhere in the machinery of him, he had calculated that the Slayer's destruction of the anchors was worth his own protection, and that his survival now required someone else to survive first. It was not compassion. It was not friendship. It was a mathematics of survival that had never previously appeared in his design, but it was, unmistakably, cooperation. The Slayer noticed. He did not slow. He did not think, but his next shot went 2 feet wider than it needed to, because Doomsday was standing in the path, and the shot arrived a moment earlier than any anchor could have expected, and another anchor burst. Around them, the landscape screamed. The Devourer felt for the first time since its creation the sensation of being outpaced. Its adaptations were falling behind. Its arcs were being turned. Its anchors were failing in a sequence it could not predict, because 2 logics were working against it at once. And the 2 logics had never before belonged to the same offensive. Ahead of them, a final chamber began to open. And inside the chamber, the true heart of the Devourer beat once, and then beat again, and then, very slowly, began to be afraid. The chamber that held the heart of the Devourer was not built to be entered. It had no doors because no one had ever been intended to reach it. Its walls curved inward in ways that eyes could not follow, and its ceiling was open to a sky that did not exist above any surface of hell. In the center of the chamber, suspended in nothing, hung the heart itself, and it was not a heart, and it was not one thing. It was a face, or many faces, or the memory of every face that had ever been consumed by conflict since the first 2 immortal beings had struck each other in the dawn of creation. The face turned as the Slayer and Doomsday entered, and it wore, briefly, the expression of a sentinel king the Slayer had known long ago. Then it wore the expression of a scientist in a laboratory on a world called Krypton, and the face aged and grew tender and grew afraid. Then it wore the expression of a mother holding a child in red and blue. Then it wore the expression of no one at all, the expression of a hunger that had run out of masks. The Devourer spoke a final time. It told them, in the voice of every immortal it had ever fed upon, the truth of what it was. It had begun before the first universe. It had been the space between the first 2 thoughts. It had grown by feeding, and everything it had ever fed upon had begun as a duel between beings who could not die. Every war between gods. Every clash between titans, every crusade between champions of order and champions of ruin, all of it had been arranged, encouraged, and prolonged by the pressure of its hunger radiating through the walls of its prison, subtly bending the choices of lesser beings toward the pattern that would feed it. It had been patient. It had waited across ages. And it had waited, in particular, for 2 warriors who could not, by any measure known to any world, ever finish killing each other. In the Slayer, it had found one. In Doomsday, it had found the second. And in bringing them together, it had almost transcended. Now it stood exposed. Now its greatest source of power was standing in its heart chamber. And now, it told them, it would consume them both directly. The chamber closed. The walls, which had merely curved, now folded. The sky, which had merely been empty, now filled with mouths. From every surface, tendrils, teeth, and hands emerged, and they came inward in a wave that would have swallowed a moon. The Slayer lifted the crucible. He had been saving the crucible for this moment. The blade of argent light bloomed brighter than it had ever bloomed. Brighter than the artifact was designed to sustain. Brighter than his own hand could safely hold. He drove it forward in a single motion and buried it to the hilt in the face at the center of the chamber. The face split. Argent light poured out of the wound in a torrent, and the torrent began to consume the walls of the chamber, and the mouths of the sky, and the tendrils that had almost reached them. But the torrent was too great even for the crucible to shape. It would tear apart the chamber, and it would tear apart hell, and it would tear apart both warriors in the process, unless something caught it, something living, something that could absorb the impossible and evolve to survive it. Doomsday stepped into the light. He did not know why. Something inside him had recognized that the survival calculation had, for one final moment, required him to become a vessel rather than a weapon. He raised his arms as if to embrace the torrent, and the torrent poured into him. His skin split. His bones burned. His eyes were unmade and remade. His body swelled to twice its previous size, then split apart, then rebuilt itself larger still. New plates grew, then were burned away, then grew again beneath the burning. He roared, and the roar had no rage in it, because rage was too small a word for what was happening inside him. He was becoming, in real time, a creature no universe had ever previously produced. He was becoming the only thing in creation that could hold the light of a dying god and not be extinguished. At the height of it, he turned, and the light turned with him, and together they poured out of him in a single directed strike into the wound the crucible had opened. The heart of the devourer burst from within. The explosion tore the chamber outward. It tore the prison outward. It tore the roots of hell outward. Above them, on the ruined surface, the crater vanished as the ground beneath it opened. And above the crater, the sky itself split into a wound that mirrored the wound Doomsday had first fallen through. Ancient fortresses collapsed. Legions that had marched for the Dark Lord silenced in mid-step and were never heard from again. Rivers of fire ran cold. Cathedrals of pain forgot their function and stood empty for the first time since their carving. The devourer and all it had built unmade itself. When the light finally receded and the world returned to something that could be measured, the Slayer stood at the edge of a crater that no longer had a bottom. He was alive. His armor was cracked in 100 places. His visor had been half torn away. He turned, slowly, and looked for Doomsday. Doomsday was standing. He was smaller than he had been at the height of the transformation, but larger than he had been at the beginning of the descent. His skin bore patterns that had not existed on any Doomsday of any timeline. His eyes had settled into a color that was quieter than rage, though rage still lived inside it. He was breathing, and his breathing was slower than it had ever been, because for the first time in his existence, he was tired. The two of them looked at each other across the ruin. Neither spoke. Around them, hell lay changed, not saved, for hell could never be saved, but altered, redigit. A power that had lain beneath it since before time had been torn out of it, and the wound it left behind would take ages to close. Whole kingdoms would need to be rebuilt. Whole thrones would need new occupants. The Dark Lord, if he still lived, would not rule what he had ruled before. Above them, the sky slowly began to cool. Somewhere in the distance, a wounded demon crawled out from beneath a slab of stone and began, very quietly, to weep, because it had believed that the end of everything had come, and it had not, and it did not know what to do with the mercy of that. The Slayer lowered the broken crucible. The war was over. The other war, the endless one, waited. They walked in silence out of the ruin. Neither of them chose the direction. Their feet chose it for them, because bodies that had been fighting for days needed a shape to move in, and moving forward was the only shape either of them knew. They passed the corpses of titans they had killed together, and neither of them looked twice. They passed the shattered banners of the Dark Lord's army, and neither of them stooped to read the sigils. They passed one another sometimes, and each time they passed, neither of them looked at the other, because looking was not something that had ever been part of their language. At last they came to a plateau at the edge of what had once been the crater, and they stopped, because the plateau ended in a cliff that dropped into the wound in the world. The wound was closing, slowly, as if the sky itself were regretting what it had allowed to fall through. The tear that had brought Doomsday to hell began to seal, but it had not sealed yet. The colors that did not belong to any spectrum still bled at its edges, and inside those colors, the shape of another universe could be dimly seen. A yellow sun, a sky that was blue instead of red. Continents whose outlines had been mapped by cartographers who had never heard of hell. Vega spoke softly in the Slayer's helmet. He explained what the rift was and what it offered. He explained that his readings indicated it would remain stable for perhaps another hour before closing forever. He explained that a creature of Doomsday's mass and energy signature could, in principle, be returned through it to the universe from which he had come, and that once returned, he would resume the pattern of his previous existence. Endless death, endless resurrection, endless combat against the guardians of a world that had learned, painfully, to keep him at bay. Doomsday did not speak. Doomsday could not speak. But he looked at the rift, and something inside him, some faint remnant of the design that had built him, seemed to consider it. The Slayer said nothing. He did not counsel. He did not urge. He turned his back on the rift, because his path did not lie through it, and his path had never been anything other than forward. He looked once at Doomsday, only once, and the look was not friendship, and it was not gratitude, and it was not farewell. It was recognition. The recognition of one endless thing by another. Then he began to walk. He walked down from the plateau. He walked across the plain of the dead. He walked into the smoke that still hung over the ruined kingdoms of hell, and the smoke received him, because the smoke had always received him, and he vanished into it as he had vanished into every horizon of every age he had ever crossed. Doomsday stood alone at the edge of the wound. He looked at the yellow sun. He looked at the blue sky. He looked at the shape of the continents whose outlines were becoming clearer as the rift narrowed. Something in him remembered faintly the taste of that air. Something in him remembered the woman in red and blue. Something in him remembered a laboratory and a scientist and a cage. He looked away from the rift. He looked instead at the smoke into which the Slayer had walked, and beyond the smoke at the vast, wounded, still living body of hell. Cities that would need to be broken again as they rebuilt. Barons that would rise, in time, to fill the thrones the Dark Lord had left empty. New horrors that this place would grow, because this place had never stopped growing horrors, and never would. A land that was, in its own dark and permanent way, a factory of enemies. A factory that would never close for as long as reality kept its shape. For the first time in his existence, he was not being driven forward by the rage of another being. He was choosing, not with the tenderness of a soul that had discovered virtue. He had discovered no such thing, but with the recognition, as clear inside him as his own heartbeat, that this place would keep producing monsters, and that he would keep destroying them, and that in doing so, he would not be redeemed, and would not be forgiven, and would not be loved, but would be, at last, useful in a way that his old universe had never permitted him to be. The rift closed behind him. He did not turn to watch it close. He walked away from the cliff, and his footsteps shook the plateau. He walked into the smoke on a path parallel to the one the Slayer had taken, but not the same. Two lines, drawn across the same field, that would never quite converge, and would never quite diverge, and would from time to time cross each other at the intersection of some future war, and would nod without speaking, and would move on. Somewhere in the distance, a demon that had survived by hiding beneath a slab of stone crawled out into the ash, and looked up at the sky and saw two figures walking apart across the burning horizon. It did not know their names. It did not need to. It knew only that both of them were still moving, and that both of them were moving away, and that this was, for the moment, the greatest gift the world had ever given it. In every universe, there are forces born to conquer and forces born to protect. Sometimes they meet, and their meeting ends worlds. But sometimes, in the strange arithmetic of destruction, their meeting saves worlds instead, not through mercy and not through love, but through the collision of two absolutes that were meant to be enemies, and became, for a single hour, something no story had ever prepared to describe. History would not record what passed between them. History would record only the devastation and the strange calm afterward, and the two silhouettes on the horizon that never quite left the tellers of the tale alone. The Doomslayer walked into the fires he had always walked into. Doomsday walked into the fires he had never known he was for, and Hell, watching, understood at last that some legends never end, they only find new ground.